Our final module of the semester is on the environment. We often consider pollution, as we talked about before in the class, or environmental damage, cleanup costs to be a negative externality associated with production. The text uses refrigerators as an example. It's true that refrigerators use energy, but they're also somewhat necessary for existence. So I'm not sure this is a great example. I usually like to think about maybe burning coal or plastic waste, single-use plastics, things like that as negative externalities, right? So in general, what's a negative externality? Remember, you have some production. Production has costs represented by the supply curve. The supply curve shows producers' willingness to sell at any given price. And what we say with negative externalities is that there are extra social costs. So supply should actually be, this is lower supply, even though it's higher vertically. This is less supply, a lower quantity supplied at every price. So it would be socially beneficial to have a smaller quantity supplied at each price, right? For example, at a price of 700, socially we might like this amount, about 40,000, but privately, private suppliers will only consider their profits and produce somewhere like this, maybe 50,000. Right, so this is a negative externality. Social costs exceed private costs. So the market quantity here with our private supply curve and demand is too high. We would like there to be a lower market quantity, or in other words, it would be socially optimal to have a lower market quantity of pollution. Right, so just to show what we're talking about here in terms of pollution, one type of pollution is plastic production. So plastic production could be a clear negative externality because it produces this waste which doesn't go away. It needs to be incinerated or dealt with in some other way. Large amount of that is not dealt with properly and ends up in oceans, landfills, and other places. So I have some links posted on the extent of plastic pollution of oceans, plastic pollution. That'll be a good topic of discussion for our final week's discussion. What we're showing here on this graphic is that only about half of the plastic ever produced in the world has been destroyed or incinerated or recycled, still in use. The other half has been discarded or is in landfills. So of the amount in total produced in history, about half is still out there, but not in use, just sort of in landfills mostly, also in oceans, in parks, right? You see it if you go up to Horsetooth and other public parks, plastic everywhere. All right, so economists share environmentalist concerns about the costs of cleanup as well as the cost to animal and ultimately to human life. Again, going back to this negative externality graph over here, right? Ultimately, there's going to be some higher costs, or the social supply curve is shifted left because there's going to be some sort of either cleanup cost or some sort of cost related to environmental damage, loss of animal life, and so on. Right, and some people believe that this supply curve is actually shifted much further. Right? We would like to have much less plastic pollution. So what are the solutions or possibilities for solutions to this problem, especially focusing on microplastics and plastics in the ocean, which is a topic for our week 7 discussion? Well, one type or one field of solution is a command-based solution. So the government may be justified in taking action to reduce the free market quantity of items like single-use plastic, straws, bottles, other plastic waste that ends up in the ocean and in landfills. And one possibility could be to simply mandate a reduction in the quantity produced of these items. For instance, you could either put a quota in place and say, all right, no more than this can be sold in the United States. Or you could put some sort of tax in place on the producers of these types of goods. Right, so command solutions such as the 1970 Clean Air and 1972 Clean Water Act have been moderately successful in abating pollution under the oversight of the EPA. However, these solutions do have some types of drawbacks. First of all, there's no incentive to do better than the mandate. Everybody just has to meet the mandate. So we reduce pollution by some amount, but never really more than that. And it doesn't distinguish between firms which would face high and low cost to reduce pollution. Some firms might be able to take easy steps to quickly reduce pollution. Other firms would have to pay much more in order to reduce the amount that they're polluting. There's also fine print, loopholes, lobbying. Individual companies or industries succeed in lobbying for exemption from these mandates, and so don't have to participate in environmental cleanup or pay any sort of additional cost for the pollution that they create. Right, so then of course the question is who has to pay to clean up any pollution, oil spills, things like that. That's something that we continue to talk about later. In the case that there are not clearly defined property rights, there may not be a clear answer to that question. So having clearly defined property rights ultimately will be one type of another type of solution. Okay, if you, for instance, give the property rights to public lands to either the government or to local townships, then perhaps companies have to actually pay some of the costs of these cleanups. Right, there's other types of market-based solutions rather than command-based solutions. So instead of mandating a certain level of production, governments could engage in what we call market solutions. So first of all, there could be a tax or charge, which again, we consider tax part of markets. All governments implement taxes. There's questions about how much to tax, where to tax, but that's sort of a separate question than the question of markets versus non-market solutions. So within markets, you can implement a tax, which sets a fixed rate that firms must pay in order to produce pollution. You could have a tradable permit system, which we'll talk about here in a second a little bit more. The government sells the rights to pollute to firms. Firms may purchase and trade these pollution rights from one another. And then I also mentioned property rights. In some cases now, since they're not clearly defined property rights, like for things like air and the oceans, sometimes we wonder whose job it is to maintain their quality, whose job it is to make sure people aren't polluting. So perhaps defining clear property rights could be a type of market solution. Although it's at the same time, it's difficult to think about ownership of things like air and the oceans. All right, so a pollution tax or charge, suppose we could map out the cost for each firm to reduce pollution. So this graph is showing how much it would cost firms to reduce pollution. And it's saying that in order to reduce by 10 pounds, it would cost 300. In order to reduce by 20 pounds would cost 500, and so on. All right, so the government might attempt to reduce pollution by implementing a pollution charge or a tax. And the idea is, all right, you pick some sort of amount here, it's $1,000. Companies have to pay $1,000 per unit that they pollute or to pollute a certain amount. So then the idea is that anybody who could reduce pollution for a lower cost than paying this tax will do it, right? So this only costs 300 to reduce. Right? These companies, this company or companies would rather stop polluting this amount than pay the 1,000. Right? Same for these companies and so on. Then you've got some other companies up here. Reducing this amount of pollution would cost them 1,500. So they'd rather just pay the 1,000 charge. Right? Up here, it would cost 2,500 to reduce the pollution. So they'd rather just pay the 1,000 charge. And then the idea is that this government revenue could be reinvested in environmental cleanup. Of course, there's certain assumptions here. So, what are some of the downsides to a policy like this? Well, first of all, taxation tends not to be popular, but moving beyond that, there's issues of accuracy. So how does the government know exactly what to charge? How does it know $1,000 is the right amount? There's probably no way to judge accurately, right? They might have some economists go in there and make recommendations, to try to figure out what the average costs would be to reduce pollution. So we have informed recommendations. At the same time, it's probably inexact, right? So if the government says we want to reduce pollution by this certain amount, it might not know exactly what the amount of the tax to implement is. All right, we also have a tradable permit system, and I'm going to explain tradable permits here, but really it'll just be sort of a definition question. These types of solutions here would maybe make a good match each to its definition type of question. Again, no math or anything, numbers really on the content quiz. So suppose we have 4 firms here, alpha, beta, gamma, and delta, and their current emissions are 200 for alpha, 400 for beta, 600 for gamma, and none for delta. And the government says, suppose we want to reduce pollution by half, right? So we're going to implement tradable permits with the attempt at reducing pollution by half. In other words, to start with, alpha will be allowed to pollute 100 instead of 200, beta 200 instead of 400, gamma is allowed to pollute 300 instead of 600, and delta is still not polluting. All right, so each of these companies then have to reduce their emissions, reduce their pollution in order to comply with these tradable permits. And so suppose that they try to reduce their emissions, and then after 1 year or whatever the amount of time they have to reduce pollution is, so alpha has now reduced by 50. They're now polluting 150. They were supposed to pollute 100. Right? Beta met their pollution target. They were supposed to pollute 200. They are polluting 200. Gamma actually exceeded their pollution target. So maybe it was somewhat cheap for them to reduce pollution. Now they're only polluting 200 instead of 300. Right. The idea here is that this would be profitable for a firm like Gamma to reduce their pollution or reduce pollution by more than they need to, because now what they can do is they have 100 tons of pollution permit left over, and they can sell these pollution permits. So beta has already met their pollution target. Maybe they don't need to buy it, but alpha here is still producing more pollution than they're supposed to. They only have 100 tons of permits. They need an extra 50 tons. So gamma could sell these pollution permits to firm alpha. And then we have this firm delta over here. Maybe they want to do some polluting. Maybe they want to come into a market and start producing. They need pollution permits in order to do that. So then they can buy some of firm gamma's extra pollution permits. All right, so that's how this works. The government issues pollution permits given how much they want to reduce pollution by. Some firms will be able to reduce pollution by even more than that, and they have incentive to do it because then they can sell their extra pollution permits to other companies. Right, so the idea here is that you might ultimately reduce pollution by more than is necessary or more than the target. Right, again, another market-based solution. There's problems with this, as usual, unpopularity of government intervention in markets. All right, so a tradable permit system would be, they're called market-based solutions, but ultimately we have a level of government intervention here, which we wouldn't call it command because they're not specifying a certain level of overall production, sort of based on what firms were already producing, rather than the government saying, okay, here is the total amount we're going to produce and the total amount we're going to pollute. But it's enough government intervention that it's sort of seen sometimes as being on the path to a command-based system and therefore unpopular. And then, of course, there's the accuracy issue, how many pollution permits to issue. Then there's the enforcement issue, right? So how do you measure how much each firm is polluting? Well, in an ideal world, each firm just knows that and reports it accurately. But of course, there's incentive for firms to misreport or fudge the numbers in some way. And so you need some sort of oversight committee, which is costly. And again, there's issues related to lobbying to get out of these sorts of systems and so on. All right, so it's the same types of issues appear in kind of all of these market-based systems. Right, finally, we have property rights here. So here's our example, Springfield with the nuclear factory and our Springfield Lake with the three-eyed fish, right? So who owns the air and the water that people of the town of Springfield drink? A lot of times there's not a clearly defined answer. Water rights are generally limited to physical property ownership, and so that excludes things like the oceans, the Great Lakes and so on in the United States are generally kind of publicly owned. So the question is, again, who is going to protect those from being polluted? In absence of clearly defined property rights, especially related to air and water pollution, the Springfield nuclear plant here can just pollute as much as they want into what might be a water source for population and not necessarily have to face any consequences or cleanup. Public or the government is left with the cleanup costs of this pollution. And so without any clearly defined property rights, the citizens would have to pay Mr. Burns here at the nuclear plant to stop polluting. However, the idea is with clearly defined property rights about pollution or water and clean air ownership, perhaps you give those property rights to the city or township, the people who are drinking the water. Then Mr. Burns has to pay the citizens for the right to pollute rather than just being able to and somebody having to clean it up. Right, so again, similar problems. How do you define the property rights? Who gets to pick who the property rights go to? Right, the government is going to pick, but then you have the lobbyist problem. So, is the public interest going to be represented if property rights are designated over clean air and water? That's a significant concern. So then costs and benefits of environmental laws and environmental cleanups. The info from the slides I posted is a little bit outdated now, but the EPA estimated that the Clean Air and Water Acts cost about $500 billion public money between about 1970 and 1990 to enforce. However, the estimated benefits of avoiding premature illness, death, disease due to contaminated air and water were estimated at about 22 trillion. Right, so just looking ahead into our next week, which is sort of career paths in economics, especially at Colorado State, we have a big environmental program. A lot of that environmental work is providing estimates of prices or costs or benefits, a kind of cost-benefit analyses of certain programs, cost benefits of pollution and pollution cleanup. All right, so this sort of estimation, this sort of idea is a big part of what economists in environmental, agricultural economics do. There's also an idea about ecotourism, which might suggest that countries have an incentive to preserve wildlife because it's more profitable for tourism than destroying the wildlife. So, for example, in the Amazon, some suggestion that instead of cutting down the trees to make way for cattle farms and for lumber, they should preserve that area for ecotourism. Of course, there are problems with that. The tourists themselves bring problems, disease, crime, things like that. In terms of these remote wildlife areas, is it necessarily very cost efficient or reasonable to try to bring a lot of tourism out to the remote Amazon, for example? It might be somewhat difficult. Nonetheless, there's a push within the United States, at least, to preserve public lands as parks rather than develop. We, of course, if you were here in Fort Collins for the last voting cycle, there was the debate about whether to turn the old football stadium lands into a public park or develop it. And ultimately, while the public voted that they wanted it left as a park, it seems that some of that area will be developed. So same type of question, is it more valuable to have it as green space, as open area, or as developed land? And, there's a trend towards developing this land, but there might be some benefits of green space and open areas. In general, The Economist holds that environmental policy makes sense when the marginal benefits of the policy exceed the marginal costs. So the gains from reducing pollution by one more unit are higher than the costs of reducing that pollution. And once again, as I've alluded to, a lot of what goes into agricultural and environmental economics is this sort of cost benefit estimation. So finally, international issues related, again, air and water are shared globally. So there's some concern that environmental regulation and awareness has to be achieved at the international level. It's not going to be sufficient to have some countries going along with these cleanup efforts and other countries still polluting. This global air pollution map that I posted as a potential discussion topic shows that there are some large sections of the world which have really high air pollution, and it's not just the places that we think about, right? A lot of times we think about smog in like the Chinese cities, Los Angeles, places like that. Global air pollution exists really around the world, depending on the time. There are at some points kind of more polluted areas, inhabited areas, than unpolluted inhabited areas. Another kind of famous example of this, or to show that environmental cleanup or environmental awareness has to be an international issue, was the Chernobyl incident, right? As we know about that occurred in the Ukraine, but it turned out that something like 70 to 80% of the toxic waste which fell as a result of that incident fell on neighboring Belarus. So if you look at this global air pollution map, you'll see that the places that are polluting, the pollution doesn't necessarily stay there. It circulates in the airstream. Smaller neighboring countries, which may not be responsible for pollution, are still impacted by this pollution. Those generally in opposition to environmental regulation might argue that the laws put companies in the countries legislating at a disadvantage. So you hear that a lot in American business, right? If we have to adhere to these environmental standards, then international companies will dominate the market, or there will be incentive for companies to move out of the countries with laws and into countries that don't have the laws. So in response to that, the Paris Agreement is an international attempt to circumvent this problem by making environmental protection efforts uniform across developed and developing countries. And so again, the idea is that if all countries have to adhere to the same or similar standards, then you won't have this reallocation or shuffling of business. There won't be any incentive for businesses to simply just move their production to countries where they can pollute. Right, so that is the end of our kind of introduction into environment and environmental issues, something that if you're taking classes here at Colorado State into the future, I definitely recommend. We have a great environmental program. Dr. Ed Barbier is pretty well renowned as far as his publications on water and water pollution, so something to definitely look into as far as your future course planning. Right, let me know if you have any questions. Over the next week, I'll be putting out a final exam review. The final exam will have, it'll have some stuff on this week of pollution, maybe 5-ish questions on that, and then there will be some review questions from the previous sections. Right, good luck. Let me know if you have any questions.